Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader in the struggle for power. Part 1. Early Life and Education of Ali Khamenei. Ali Hosseini Khamenei was born on April 19, 1939 in the holy city of Mashhad in northeastern Iran, a place of deep religious significance in the Shia Islamic tradition. Mashhad, home to the shrine of Imam Reza, the eighth Imam of Twelver Shi'ism, was a city that shaped his early intellectual and spiritual worldview. His family, devoutly religious and deeply involved in clerical scholarship, had strong connections to Islamic learning and jurisprudence. His father, Javad Khamenei, was an esteemed alim and mujtahid, meaning he was a high-ranking cleric with the authority to interpret Islamic law. Javad Khamenei was born in Najaf, Iraq, a city revered among Shia Muslims as a center of religious scholarship. His strict religious principles and dedication to Islamic studies deeply influenced his son's upbringing. Ali Khamenei's mother, Khadija Mirdamadi, belonged to a lineage of distinguished religious scholars. Her father, Hashem Mirdamadi, was a highly respected cleric. Through his mother, Khamenei could trace his ancestry back to prominent Shia theologians. His lineage was a mix of Persian and Azerbaijani heritage, a common combination in Iran's ethnically diverse society. His father's family hailed from Khamenei, a town near Tabriz, a historically significant city in Azerbaijan province. Meanwhile, his mother was of Persian origin, from Yazd, a city known for its strong cultural and religious traditions. Some accounts suggest that Khamenei's ancestors originally came from Tafresh, in what is now Markazi province, before migrating to Khamenei. This mixed heritage gave him exposure to both Persian and Azerbaijani cultures, which later played a role in his ability to connect with different communities within Iran. Ali Khamenei was the second of 8 children. 2 of his brothers would later follow the path of religious scholarship. His younger brother, Hadi Khamenei, became a cleric and newspaper editor, engaging in both religious and journalistic pursuits. His elder sister, Fatemeh Hosseini Khamenei, lived a long life, passing away in 2015 at the age of 89. A childhood rooted in religion and scholarship. Ali Khamenei's childhood was deeply steeped in religious devotion and Islamic scholarship. From an early age, he was immersed in the traditional Islamic environment of Mashhad, where mosques, seminaries, and the revered shrine of Imam Reza played a crucial role in shaping young minds. His father, a strict but respected scholar, ensured that his son received a strong Islamic education. At the age of 4, he began his primary education, starting with memorization of the Quran in a maktab, a traditional Islamic school where young children were taught religious principles, Arabic grammar, and the fundamentals of Islamic jurisprudence. Khamenei was an intelligent and diligent student, quickly mastering the basics of Islamic teachings. His early years of education followed the Hausa system, the traditional Shia seminary curriculum that emphasized deep theological learning and mastery of classical Islamic texts. His teachers included Sheikh Hashem Kazvini and Ayatollah Milani, both highly influential scholars in the Mashhad Hausa. Under their guidance, he delved into the interpretation of the Quran, Hadith, sayings of the Prophet, fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, and Arabic literature. His studies encompass classical Islamic philosophy and logic, which were central to the seminary training of elite Shia scholars. Higher religious studies in Qom and Najaf. In 1957, Khamenei traveled to Najaf, Iraq, one of the holiest cities in Shia Islam, to further his religious studies. Najaf, home to the shrine of Imam Ali, the first Imam of Shia Islam, was a major center of religious learning, attracting students and scholars from across the Islamic world. However, his stay in Najaf was brief. His father did not approve of him remaining abroad for an extended period, and he was called back to Iran. After returning to Mashhad, he continued his Islamic studies before relocating to Qom in 1958, the most prestigious center for Shia Islamic education in Iran. In Qom, Khamenei studied under some of the most influential clerics of the time, including Grand Ayatollah Sayyid Hossein Borujerdi, the leading religious authority of Shia Islam at the time, and Ruhollah Khomeini, the future supreme leader of Iran. During this period, Khamenei's education went beyond theology. He became increasingly involved in political discourse, influenced by Khomeini's outspoken opposition to the policies of the Pahlavi monarchy. Like many young clerics in Qom, he became politically aware and engaged, following the discussions on Western influence in Iran, the erosion of Islamic values under the Shah's rule, and the need for greater religious governance. His studies in Qom not only honed his religious knowledge, but also planted the seeds of his future political activism. The path to political engagement. Unlike some of his contemporaries, Khamenei was not content with purely academic religious studies. He believed that Islam should play a more active role in governance, a stance that aligned him with Ruhollah Khomeini's revolutionary ideology. Even while focusing on his theological training, he maintained a deep interest in political affairs. He studied the works of Islamic thinkers and reformers, both Shia and Sunni, and followed global political movements, including anti-colonial struggles in the Middle East and North Africa. Khamenei's exposure to political ideology grew as he observed the growing discontent with the Shah's rule. He and many other clerics saw the secularization policies of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi as a direct threat to Islamic traditions. By the early 1960s, Khamenei was part of a network of clerics and scholars who sought to restore the role of Islam in public life. In 1963, Khamenei was deeply affected by the events of Khomeini's arrest following his fiery denunciations of the Shah's regime. This was a turning point. Khamenei, along with many other young clerics, became fiercely loyal to Khomeini and his vision of an Islamic government. Over the next few years, Khamenei's role in political activism grew, leading to multiple arrests and periods of imprisonment under the Pahlavi government. His early years of education and activism laid the foundation for what would later become a decades-long leadership role in Iran. As both a religious scholar and a revolutionary thinker, Khamenei's intellectual development merged Islamic theology with political action, setting him on the path toward becoming one of Iran's most powerful figures. Part 2, Political Awakening and Early Activism, 1962-1979. Ali Khamenei's transformation from a dedicated Islamic scholar to a revolutionary activist was not an overnight event. It was shaped by the political turbulence of Iran in the 1960s and 1970s, a period marked by growing discontent with the Pahlavi monarchy, the influence of Western powers, and the suppression of Islamic clerical authority. His exposure to anti-colonial movements, revolutionary ideologies, and the teachings of Ruhollah Khomeini played a crucial role in steering him toward active opposition to the Shah's regime. By the early 1960s, Khamenei had already completed his advanced religious studies in Mashhad and Qom, but his ambitions extended beyond scholarly pursuits. He saw the role of an Islamic scholar as not merely confined to religious instruction, but also as a guardian of Islamic principles and governance. This belief led him to closely follow the activities of Ayatollah Khomeini, who had begun publicly denouncing the Shah's rule. The rise of Khomeini and Khamenei's political involvement. The turning point in Khamenei's political activism came in 1963, a year that saw growing opposition to the Shah's policies. The White Revolution, a series of reforms introduced by Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, aimed at modernizing Iran, but was widely perceived by the religious establishment as an attempt to undermine Islamic traditions. Khomeini emerged as one of the most vocal critics, condemning the Shah for his alliance with the United States and Israel, the marginalization of the clergy, and the rapid westernization of Iranian society. In June 1963, Khomeini delivered a fiery speech against the Shah, denouncing him as a puppet of foreign powers. The government's response was swift and brutal. Khomeini was arrested, sparking widespread protests across Iran. Khamenei, then a young and politically active cleric, publicly supported Khomeini, participating in protests and delivering speeches against the regime. His involvement in these demonstrations brought him under the watchful eye of the Shah's intelligence agency, known as Savak. Khamenei's first arrest came later that year, as the monarchy intensified its crackdown on dissidents. He was detained and interrogated by Savak, but his release did not deter his political activities. Instead, he grew more deeply committed to the revolutionary cause. Multiple arrests and periods of imprisonment. Between 1964 and 1979, Khamenei was arrested 6 times, each time for his role in spreading anti-government propaganda, organizing religious opposition, and supporting Khomeini's teachings. He was detained in various prisons and subjected to intense interrogation by Savak, but his defiance remained unwavering. One of his most significant arrests came in 1974 when he was caught distributing clandestine pamphlets that contained Khomeini's speeches. This time, the authorities decided to impose a more severe punishment. Khamenei was sentenced to exile in the remote southeastern town of Iranshahr for a period of 3 years. While in exile, Khamenei continued his Islamic teachings, but more importantly, he built networks with local activists who were also opposed to the Shah. During this period, he came into contact with other revolutionary figures, including those associated with the Islamic leftist movements, who sought to merge Marxist and Islamic ideals in their opposition to the monarchy. Though Khamenei remained deeply committed to Shia Islam and clerical rule, his experiences broadened his understanding of revolutionary strategies. He was released early from exile in 1977, amid increasing pressure on the Shah's regime, which was struggling with mounting political and economic unrest. However, his freedom did not last long. He was arrested again as the revolutionary fervor intensified in 1978. This time, however, the political landscape was changing rapidly. The 1978-1979 Islamic Revolution. By late 1978, Iran was on the brink of revolution. Mass protests, strikes, and demonstrations had paralyzed the country. The Shah's grip on power was weakening, and his security forces could no longer contain the growing wave of dissent. Ayatollah Khomeini, who had been living in exile in Iraq and later in France, called for the complete overthrow of the monarchy and the establishment of an Islamic government. Khamenei, recently released from prison, actively participated in organizing and mobilizing resistance within Iranian cities. He played a critical role in coordinating religious groups, delivering speeches in mosques, and fostering alliances with students, labor groups, and other opposition figures. On January 16, 1979, the Shah fled Iran, effectively ending centuries of monarchical rule. 2 weeks later, on February 1, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran, greeted by millions of jubilant supporters. Khamenei was among the clerics and revolutionaries who welcomed Khomeini back. As the Pahlavi regime collapsed, the revolutionary forces swiftly moved to establish a new government. On April 1, 1979, after a national referendum, Iran was officially declared an Islamic Republic, with Khomeini as its supreme leader. The new government sought to Islamize the state, remove Western influences, and implement a Shia-based political system. Khomeini's position in the new Islamic Republic. With the monarchy dismantled, Khamenei quickly rose to prominence within the new regime. His decades of struggle, multiple imprisonments, and unwavering loyalty to Khomeini made him a trusted figure in the Islamic Republic. In the months following the revolution, he was appointed to several key positions within the government. Among his earliest roles was serving as a representative of the Revolutionary Council, a body tasked with drafting Iran's new constitution and overseeing the transition from monarchy to Islamic rule. He also became closely involved with the newly established Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, which was created to protect the revolution and counter any internal or external threats. At this stage, Khamenei was still not a senior cleric. Unlike figures such as Khomeini and Grand Ayatollah Montazeri, who were recognized as high-ranking religious leaders, Khamenei was a mid-ranking cleric, Hujjat al-Islam. However, his political acumen, revolutionary credentials, and close ties to Khomeini ensured that he quickly climbed the ranks. In 1979, he was appointed as the Deputy Minister of Defense, further solidifying his position within the military structure of the new regime. At the same time, he played a role in restructuring Iran's religious institutions, aligning them with the ideology of the revolution. His next major appointment came in 1980, when Khomeini selected him to be Tehran's Friday prayer leader, one of the most important religious positions in the country. The Friday prayer leader was responsible for delivering sermons on political and religious matters, addressing the nation, and rallying public support for the Islamic government. A rising power within the new order. By the early 1980s, Ali Khamenei had cemented himself as one of the key figures in Iran's new theocratic government. His rapid rise to power was due to a combination of factors. Loyalty to Ayatollah Khomeini, his steadfast support for Khomeini's vision of an Islamic state, positioned him as one of the revolution's trusted guardians. Revolutionary credentials. Having suffered imprisonment and exile, he was seen as a genuine revolutionary, unlike some who had joined the movement later. Connections with the IRGC. His close ties with the Revolutionary Guards gave him influence over Iran's military and security apparatus. Political pragmatism. He demonstrated strategic thinking, aligning himself with powerful factions within the government. As Iran entered the tumultuous decade of the 1980s, Khamenei's influence would continue to grow. His role in shaping Iran's post-revolution policies, his involvement in the Iran-Iraq War, and his eventual elevation to the presidency would mark the next stage of his political career. Part 3. Presidency, the Iran-Iraq War, and the Path to Supreme Leadership, 1981-1989. By the early 1980s, Ali Khamenei had firmly established himself as a key figure within Iran's post-revolutionary government. His loyalty to Ayatollah Khomeini, his connections with the Revolutionary Guards, and his political pragmatism ensured his steady rise through the ranks. The next phase of his career would see him assuming the highest elected office in the country, navigating Iran's deadliest war, and positioning himself as the eventual successor to Khomeini. The turmoil of the early 1980s, the years following the 1979 Islamic Revolution, were fraught with political upheaval, internal power struggles, and external threats. The newly established Islamic Republic faced a range of challenges. The hostage crisis, 1979 to 1981. Iranian revolutionaries stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking 52 American diplomats hostage for 44 days, triggering a deep crisis with the United States. The Iraq invasion, 1980. Saddam Hussein's Iraq launched a full-scale invasion of Iran, igniting one of the deadliest wars of the 20th century. Internal factionalism. Rival factions, including Islamists, leftists, and nationalist groups, competed for control over the new government, with Khomeini's faction gradually eliminating opposition groups. Political assassinations. In 1981, Iranian opposition groups, particularly the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, MEK, launched a series of violent attacks, assassinating senior government officials, including the president and prime minister. In this chaotic landscape, Khamenei's importance grew, as he emerged as one of the Islamic Republic's most influential voices. The 1981 assassination attempt. One of the defining moments of Khamenei's life came on June 27, 1981, when he narrowly survived an assassination attempt. At the time, he was delivering a speech at Tehran's Abu Zar Mosque when a bomb, disguised inside a tape recorder, was placed next to him. The bomb detonated, severely injuring him. The attack permanently paralyzed his right arm and left him hospitalized for months. It was widely believed that the MEK, Mujahideen-e-Khalq, was behind the attack, as the group had declared open war against the Islamic Republic following the government's crackdown on leftist and opposition groups. Khamenei's survival and resilience after the attack elevated his stature. Many within the regime saw him as a man of destiny, someone who had been spared for a greater purpose. His injuries became a symbol of sacrifice, strengthening his political credibility within the ruling establishment. Presidency. Khamenei's rise to executive power, 1981-1989. Following the assassination of President Mohammad-Ali Rajai in August 1981, Iran's leadership was in crisis. The country needed a strong and loyal figure to stabilize the government amid war and domestic unrest. In the October 1981 presidential elections, Khamenei emerged as the clear favorite. With 97% of the vote, he became Iran's third president, and notably the first cleric to hold the presidency. His presidency marked a shift in Iranian politics, as clerical figures increasingly dominated government positions. However, Khamenei's presidency was unique in that it was largely overshadowed by Khomeini's supreme authority. As supreme leader, Khomeini wielded absolute power, and the president served as more of an executive administrator rather than an independent head of state. Khamenei worked closely with Prime Minister Mir Hossein Mousavi, who was tasked with managing the country's war-torn economy and military affairs. While Khamenei focused on ideological and military matters, Mousavi took charge of domestic policies and economic planning. Their working relationship was often tense, but they remained united in their loyalty to Khomeini. Khamenei's role in the Iran-Iraq War, 1980-1988. One of the most defining aspects of Khamenei's presidency was his direct involvement in the Iran-Iraq War. By the time he became president, the war was in its second year, and Iran had transitioned from a defensive stance to a counter-offensive strategy aimed at pushing Iraq out of Iranian territory. Khamenei played a key role in coordinating military operations, working closely with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, and regular military forces. His personal connections with the IRGC's leadership gave him significant influence over Iran's military strategy. Key aspects of Khamenei's role in the war: strengthening the Revolutionary Guards. Khamenei expanded the power and resources of the IRGC, transforming it from a revolutionary militia into a major military force. He supported the integration of religious ideology into military training, emphasizing martyrdom, sacrifice, and Islamic values in combat. Advocating for total war against Iraq. While some Iranian officials sought negotiated settlements, Khamenei was among those who supported continuing the war until Iraq's total defeat. He frequently visited frontline troops, delivering religious and motivational speeches to boost morale. Consolidating political and military power. His close ties with the IRGC's leadership gave him a powerful base of support, which would prove crucial in his later ascent to supreme leader. His position as a wartime president strengthened his influence, as military success was increasingly linked to his leadership. Despite Iran's early victories, the war dragged on for 8 years, causing immense destruction and costing hundreds of thousands of lives. By 1988, both Iran and Iraq were economically exhausted, and Khomeini reluctantly accepted a ceasefire, likening it to drinking a chalice of poison. The transition to supreme leader, 1989. As the war ended, Iran entered a new political phase. Ayatollah Khomeini's health was deteriorating, and the question of succession loomed large. Initially, Khomeini's designated successor was Ayatollah Hussein Ali Montazeri, but in early 1989, Montazeri fell out of favor due to his criticism of the government's human rights violations. With Montazeri sidelined, the Assembly of Experts, Iran's highest clerical body responsible for selecting the supreme leader, was left with no clear successor. This created a political crisis, as Khomeini's death would leave a power vacuum. In June 1989, Khomeini passed away, and the Assembly of Experts convened to select a new supreme leader. Despite not being the most senior cleric, Khamenei was chosen as Khomeini's successor in a surprising turn of events. His appointment was backed by powerful figures such as Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, who claimed that Khomeini had endorsed Khamenei as the next leader. However, there was one major problem. Khamenei was not a marja, the highest-ranking Shia authority. Iran's constitution required the supreme leader to be a grand ayatollah, which Khamenei was not. To resolve this issue, the Assembly of Experts rushed through a constitutional amendment, lowering the qualification criteria. On June 4, 1989, Ali Khamenei was officially appointed as supreme leader, assuming ultimate authority over Iran's political, military, and religious institutions. From president to supreme leader, Khamenei's presidency played a crucial role in shaping his leadership style. His experiences during the Iran-Iraq War, his close ties with the Revolutionary Guards, and his navigation of internal power struggles prepared him for his decades-long rule as supreme leader. His appointment marked the beginning of a new era, one that would see him consolidate absolute power, suppress opposition, and transform Iran into a military clerical state. The next phase of his rule would be defined by political repression, ideological expansion, and his long-standing rivalry with the West. Part 4. Consolidation of Power as Supreme Leader, Shah 1989-1999. The appointment of Ali Khamenei as Supreme Leader of Iran in June 1989 marked the beginning of a new era in the Islamic Republic. Unlike his predecessor, Ruhollah Khomeini, who had enjoyed widespread religious legitimacy and charismatic authority, Khamenei faced significant challenges in asserting his dominance over Iran's political, religious, and military institutions. In the decade following his rise to power, he focused on consolidating control, eliminating political rivals, and reshaping the power structure of the Islamic Republic to ensure his authority remained unchallenged. The political landscape after Khamenei's appointment as supreme leader was not universally accepted. At the time of his selection, he was only a mid-ranking cleric, Hujjat al-Islam, and lacked the religious credentials of a grand Ayatollah. Many senior clerics viewed him as unqualified for the role. To resolve this issue, the Assembly of Experts, Iran's governing body responsible for selecting the supreme leader, modified the constitution, removing the requirement that the leader be a marja, a high-ranking religious authority. Khamenei's rise was strongly supported by key political figures, especially Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, who played a crucial role in persuading the assembly to back Khamenei. However, despite Rafsanjani's initial support, the two would later become bitter rivals as Khamenei consolidated absolute power. At the same time, Iran was at a critical crossroads. The country was recovering from the Iran-Iraq War, which had devastated its economy and left hundreds of thousands dead. Political factions within the Islamic Republic were deeply divided between hardliners and reformists. Foreign relations with the West remained hostile, particularly with the United States. Faced with these challenges, Khamenei embarked on a multi-pronged strategy to secure his rule: strengthening his religious authority, expanding control over the military and security forces, crushing political rivals and dissent, shaping the Iranian economy to benefit his loyalists, maintaining an anti-Western foreign policy. 1. Strengthening his religious authority. One of Khamenei's first tasks as supreme leader was to increase his religious legitimacy. Since he lacked the theological stature of Khomeini, he used several tactics to bolster his religious image. In 1994, the Society of Seminary Teachers of Qom, a major clerical institution, declared Khamenei a marja, grand Ayatollah. However, many senior clerics refused to recognize him as such. He took direct control of major seminaries in Qom and Mashhad, placing loyal clerics in key religious institutions. He controlled religious endowments in major shrines, including Astan Quds Razavi, one of the wealthiest religious institutions in Iran. Despite these efforts, many prominent Shia clerics in Iran and Iraq continued to reject his religious authority, instead recognizing grand Ayatollahs such as Hossein Ali Montazeri, Muhammad Shirazi, and Ali Sistani as more qualified religious leaders. 2. Expanding control over the military and security forces. Khamenei understood that true power in Iran depended on control over the military and intelligence apparatus. To achieve this, he focused on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, the elite military force established after the revolution. Appointing loyalists, Khamenei purged commanders suspected of disloyalty and replaced them with individuals personally loyal to him. Strengthening the IRGC, under Khamenei, the IRGC became more powerful than the regular army, gaining control over intelligence, security operations, and economic enterprises. Expanding the Basij, he increased funding for the Basij militia, a paramilitary force used to suppress dissent and enforce ideological conformity. By the mid-1990s, Khamenei had transformed the IRGC into the most powerful institution in Iran, ensuring that no political faction could challenge him without facing military consequences. 3. Crushing political rivals and dissent. Throughout the 1990s, Khamenei systematically eliminated political opponents and dissenters. His most significant rival in the early years was Ayatollah Hossein Ali Montazeri, who had once been Khomeini's designated successor. Montazeri criticized Khamenei's lack of religious qualifications and his role in the mass executions of political prisoners in 1988. In 1997, after Montazeri publicly questioned Khamenei's legitimacy, his religious school was shut down and he was placed under house arrest for several years. Beyond Montazeri, Khamenei also targeted reformist politicians who advocated for greater political freedoms, journalists and intellectuals who criticized the supreme leader's policies, opposition groups including the MEK, Mujahideen Khalq, many of whom were executed or imprisoned. One of the most notorious periods of political repression was the chain murders of the late 1990s, where Iranian intelligence agents assassinated dozens of dissidents, writers, and intellectuals. Although the killings were officially blamed on rogue agents, many believe they were carried out with Khamenei's approval. 4. Reshaping the Iranian economy, Khamenei also sought to consolidate economic power within institutions loyal to him. He expanded the financial empire of Sittad, an organization that controlled vast land holdings and confiscated properties, key industries, banks, and oil revenues, wealthy religious foundations, bonyads, that operated as state-controlled economic entities. This ensured that Khamenei's inner circle, particularly the IRGC and loyal clerics, held economic dominance, further securing his grip on power. Maintaining an anti-Western foreign policy, Khamenei remained committed to an aggressive anti-Western stance, shaping Iran's foreign policy based on confrontation with the United States and Israel. He opposed normalization with the U.S., branding it as Iran's greatest enemy. Iran continued supporting militant groups, including Hezbollah, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad, solidifying its role in regional conflicts. The 1996 Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia, allegedly carried out by Iranian-backed militants, further escalated tensions with the West. At the same time, Iran faced increasing isolation, as the U.S. imposed stricter sanctions, particularly targeting Iran's nuclear program, which Khamenei strongly defended. The 1997 presidential election, the rise of reformists. Despite Khamenei's tightening grip on power, Iranian society was changing. By the late 1990s, many Iranians, especially the younger generation, demanded greater social freedoms and political reforms. This led to the landslide victory of Mohammad Khatami, a moderate reformist cleric, in the 1997 presidential election. Khatami's victory stunned the conservative establishment, as he campaigned on a platform of expanding political freedoms, allowing more press freedom, easing social restrictions, particularly for women and youth. Khamenei, though wary of Khatami's reformist agenda, initially tolerated him. However, as Khatami's reforms gained traction, Khamenei and his hardliner allies began obstructing his policies, setting the stage for a major political confrontation in the 2000s. The supreme leader's grip tightens. By the end of the 1990s, Khamenei had successfully entrenched his power. He solidified his religious authority despite initial skepticism. He cemented his control over the IRGC and intelligence agencies. He eliminated key political rivals and crushed dissent. He expanded Iran's economic empire to benefit loyalists. However, the rise of reformist movements and increasing public dissatisfaction signaled that new challenges lay ahead. The next phase of his rule would be defined by his battles against reformist forces, mass protests, and increasing tensions with the West. Part 5. Reformist challenges, mass protests, and Khamenei's increasing authoritarianism, 1919 to 2009. By the late 1990s, Ali Khamenei's grip on power had been solidified, yet it faced a new and significant challenge: the rise of reformist forces. The election of Mohammad Khatami as president in 1997 on a platform of political reform, greater press freedom, and social liberalization exposed deep divisions within the Iranian regime. Khamenei, despite his tight control over the military, judiciary, and intelligence agencies, found himself increasingly at odds with a reform-minded population. The 2000s would be defined by intense political struggles, widespread protests, and Khamenei's shift toward a more authoritarian rule. During this decade, he relied heavily on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, the Basij militia, and the judiciary to suppress opposition and maintain his absolute control over Iran's political landscape. The 1999 student protests, a turning point. The first major confrontation between Khamenei and reformists erupted in July 1999, when Iranian students launched mass protests against government censorship and political repression. Causes of the 1999 student uprising. Reformist President Khatami sought to expand press freedoms, leading to the growth of independent newspapers critical of Khamenei and the conservative establishment. The judiciary, controlled by Khamenei's allies, shut down reformist newspapers, triggering widespread outrage. Student activists at the University of Tehran organized peaceful demonstrations in response to the press crackdown. On July 8, 1999, police and the Basij militia, a paramilitary force loyal to Khamenei, stormed a student dormitory, beating and arresting dozens of students. The crackdown sparked nationwide protests, with students demanding freedom of speech and political reforms, the resignation of Khamenei, an end to censorship and police brutality. For several days, tens of thousands of protesters took to the streets, marking the largest anti-government demonstrations since the 1979 revolution. Khamenei's response. A ruthless crackdown. Khamenei, alarmed by the scale of the unrest, responded with force. He accused the protesters of being manipulated by foreign enemies. He ordered security forces to crush the protests, leading to mass arrests, torture, and several deaths. The Basiji and IRGC violently attacked demonstrators, effectively ending the uprising within a week. The 1999 student protests marked a turning point. It was the first open challenge to Khamenei's rule from within the younger generation, and his response set a precedent for future authoritarian crackdowns. The 2000 parliamentary elections, reformists win, Khamenei strikes back. Despite the violent suppression of the 1999 protests, the reformist movement continued to grow. In the 2000 parliamentary elections, reformist candidates won a majority in the Iranian parliament, Majlis, a direct challenge to Khamenei's conservative allies. Khamenei's counterattack, unwilling to allow reformists to gain real power, Khamenei used his control over the Guardian Council, a body that vets electoral candidates, to block key reformist initiatives. The Guardian Council rejected reformist legislation aimed at limiting the supreme leader's power, disqualified reformist candidates in later elections to ensure conservative dominance, used the judiciary to arrest leading reformist politicians and activists. Despite public enthusiasm for reform, Khamenei made it clear that he would not tolerate any dilution of his absolute power. The 2005 presidential election, the rise of Mohammad-Ali Rajai. By the mid-2000s, Khamenei and his allies were determined to reverse the reformist gains of the late 1990s. The key moment came in the 2005 presidential election, where Khamenei played a decisive role in promoting and endorsing an obscure hardline politician, Mohammad-Ali Rajai. Why Khamenei backed Ahmadinejad? Loyalty to Khamenei. Unlike reformist politicians, Ahmadinejad was a staunch conservative who pledged total obedience to the supreme leader. Military ties. Ahmadinejad had strong connections with the IRGC and the Basij, both of which had become Khamenei's power base. Anti-Western and populist rhetoric. Ahmadinejad's hostility toward the US and Israel aligned with Khamenei's vision of Iran as the leader of the axis of resistance. Ahmadinejad's victory in 2005 signaled the end of the reformist era as conservative hardliners regained control of the executive branch. With Ahmadinejad as president, Khamenei further consolidated his control, ensuring that reformists remained marginalized in Iran's political system. The 2009 presidential election and the Green Movement. Despite his authoritarian success in the 2000s, Khamenei faced his biggest political crisis in 2009, when millions of Iranians took to the streets to protest what they believed was a fraudulent presidential election. Background of the 2009 election. Ahmadinejad ran for re-election against two main challengers, Mir Hossein Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi, both moderate reformists. Massive voter turnout suggested strong support for Mousavi, particularly among young people and urban voters. When results were announced, Ahmadinejad was declared the winner with 63% of the vote, a result widely viewed as rigged. The Green Movement. Protests erupt nationwide. The announcement of Ahmadinejad's re-election triggered the largest protests in Iran since the 1979 revolution. The movement became known as the Green Movement, symbolizing demands for democracy and electoral transparency, an end to Khamenei's unchecked power, a rejection of the theocratic dictatorship. Millions of protesters filled the streets of Tehran and other major cities chanting, "Where is my vote? Death to the dictator! Down with Khamenei!" Khamenei's response, a brutal crackdown. As protests intensified, Khamenei delivered a historic sermon on June 19, 2009, in which he declared Ahmadinejad's victory legitimate, blamed foreign enemies, particularly the US and Britain, for instigating unrest, warned protesters that further demonstrations would be met with force. Immediately after his speech, IRGC forces, the Basiji militia, and police launched a brutal crackdown. Thousands of protesters were arrested, including key reformist leaders. Security forces opened fire on crowds, killing and injuring hundreds. Detainees were tortured, raped, and executed in prisons such as Evin Prison and Karzak Detention Center. The Green Movement was ultimately suppressed, but the events of 2009 revealed a deep crisis of legitimacy for Khamenei. For the first time, large segments of the Iranian public openly called for his removal, showing that his grip on power was no longer unchallenged. The decade that shaped Khamenei's authoritarian rule, between 1999 and 2009, Khamenei crushed student protests and reformist movements, manipulated elections to ensure conservative dominance, used the IRGC and Basiji to violently suppress dissent, endorsed Ahmadinejad as his tool for maintaining control. However, the Green Movement protests of 2009 demonstrated that Khamenei's rule was not unshakable. Although he had successfully crushed his enemies, public anger against his dictatorship continued to grow. The next decade would see Khamenei facing increasing economic crises, international isolation, and more waves of popular uprisings. Part 6. The 2010s. Economic struggles, the nuclear deal, and the cycle of protests. The 2010s was a decade of escalating crises and challenges for Ali Khamenei's rule. Although he had successfully suppressed the Green Movement protests of 2009, the discontent that fueled the uprising did not disappear. Instead, it grew beneath the surface, manifesting in economic dissatisfaction, political opposition, and repeated waves of protests. At the same time, Iran's international standing became increasingly complicated. Khamenei faced crippling US and European sanctions, growing regional tensions, and the critical question of Iran's nuclear program. The decade was marked by his cautious endorsement of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, his continued hostility toward the West, and his crackdowns on internal opposition. 2011-2012, the Arab Spring and Khamenei's paranoia. In early 2011, as the Arab Spring uprising spread across the Middle East and North Africa, Khamenei initially celebrated the revolutions, seeing them as part of an Islamic awakening that could benefit Iran. However, he quickly changed his stance when protests erupted in Syria, Iran's key ally, and Iran itself. The Iranian protests of 2011-2012, inspired by the revolts in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, Iranians returned to the streets in early 2011 to protest against the conservative hardliners and Khamenei's rule. Reformist leaders Mir Hossein Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi, both key figures in the 2009 Green Movement, called for demonstrations. Khamenei responded with mass arrests of opposition figures, including Mousavi and Karoubi, who were placed under house arrest, where they remain today. A brutal crackdown by the IRGC and Basiji militia, leading to several deaths. Censorship of social media and communication networks to prevent protests from spreading. Though the protests were contained, they reinforced a pattern of recurring dissent against Khamenei's leadership, proving that Iran's internal discontent had not faded. The Iran nuclear deal and Khamenei's dilemma, 2013-2015. By 2013, Iran's economy was in severe decline, primarily due to U.S. and international sanctions targeting its oil exports and financial system. The sanctions imposed over Iran's nuclear program caused skyrocketing inflation, a collapse in Iran's currency, the rial, widespread unemployment, and economic hardship. Faced with growing economic instability, Iran's 2013 presidential election resulted in the victory of Hassan Rouhani, a moderate politician who promised negotiations with the West to ease sanctions. Khamenei's reluctant support for the nuclear deal. Although Khamenei had long opposed engagement with the United States, he allowed Rouhani and his team to negotiate with world powers. The result was the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal, signed in July 2015. Under the agreement, Iran agreed to limit its nuclear program in exchange for the lifting of economic sanctions, allow international inspections to monitor compliance, reduce its uranium enrichment activities. Khamenei publicly endorsed the deal but remained skeptical, warning that the U.S. could not be trusted. His hardliner allies within the IRGC also criticized the agreement, fearing that closer ties with the West could weaken their grip on power. Nevertheless, the temporary lifting of sanctions led to short-term economic relief, giving Rouhani political momentum and boosting hope among reformist supporters. 2017 to 2019, protests return amid economic collapse. Despite the nuclear deal, Iran's economy remained weak, and corruption within Khamenei's inner circle further worsened public discontent. By 2017, economic hardships, exacerbated by Khamenei's prioritization of military expansion over domestic welfare, led to nationwide protests. The 2017-2018 protests, economic grievances, and anti-Khamenei chants. In December 2017, protests erupted across Iranian cities, initially over rising food prices and unemployment. However, they quickly evolved into anti-government demonstrations with crowds chanting, "Death to Khamenei! No to Gaza! No to Lebanon! We give our lives for Iran! Clerics get lost!" The protests marked a shift in Iranian dissent, as demonstrators openly blamed Khamenei and the ruling elite for their suffering. Khamenei once again responded with violent crackdowns, resulting in at least 25 deaths, mass arrests of protesters and activists, censorship of online communication, blocking Telegram and Instagram. Though the protests died down, they proved that Khamenei's rule was facing deep legitimacy issues, even among the traditional working-class base that had once supported the regime. Trump withdraws from the nuclear deal. 2018. In May 2018, U.S. President Donald Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal and reimposed severe sanctions. This move collapsed Iran's economy, with the rial losing over 60% of its value, triggered inflation rates exceeding 40%, severely restricted oil exports, Iran's main revenue source. Khamenei blamed the U.S., calling Trump's decision proof that negotiations with the West were futile. However, his hardliner approach only worsened Iran's economic misery, fueling more protests. 2019 to 2020, the deadliest crackdown under Khamenei. In November 2019, Iran faced one of its largest and deadliest uprisings after the government raised fuel prices by 50% overnight. The 2019-20 protests, a national uprising, protesters blocked roads, burned banks, and attacked government buildings. The demonstrations spread to over 100 cities, showing the depth of national anger. For the first time, even conservative rural areas joined the protests. Khamenei ordered the IRGC and security forces to crush the uprising. Within a few days, over 1,500 protesters were killed, according to leaked reports. Thousands were arrested, many tortured or executed in secret trials. Internet access was cut nationwide for days, preventing the outside world from seeing the scale of violence. The 2019 crackdown was the deadliest act of state repression under Khamenei's rule, surpassing even the 2009 Green Movement suppression. It marked his total reliance on brute force to maintain power. Conclusion: a supreme leader under siege. By 2020, Khamenei's leadership had crushed multiple waves of protests but failed to eliminate public discontent, destroyed reformist opposition but alienated Iran's younger population, lost the economic benefits of the nuclear deal due to Trump's withdrawal. Despite his brutal suppression of dissent, Khamenei faced an increasingly fragile regime. The Iranian people had lost trust in his leadership, and new protests were inevitable. The next phase of his rule would see even greater unrest, worsening economic hardship, and new foreign policy crises. His final years in power would be marked by some of the most intense challenges he had ever faced. Part 7. The 2020s Unprecedented Challenges, the Mahsa Amini protests, and Khamenei's struggle to maintain control. By 2020, Ali Khamenei's rule faced its greatest period of instability since he became supreme leader in 1989. The economy was collapsing under U.S. sanctions, public dissatisfaction was at an all-time high, and Iran was increasingly isolated on the world stage. However, the most serious threat to his authority emerged in 2022, when the death of a young woman, Mahsa Amini, sparked a nationwide uprising that directly challenged his leadership. This period saw Khamenei doubling down on repression, relying more than ever on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, the Basij militia, and state-controlled propaganda to maintain his grip on power. However, for the first time, his ability to control the country was seriously questioned. 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic and Khamenei's misinformation. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed Khamenei's incompetence and distrust of the West in a new way. As the virus spread across Iran, Khamenei refused Western vaccines, calling them a conspiracy by the United States and the United Kingdom, promoted unscientific treatments, including Islamic herbal remedies and prayers, downplayed the severity of the virus, despite Iran being one of the hardest hit countries in the region. By mid-2021, tens of thousands of Iranians had died, and the government's mismanagement fueled new public anger. Many saw Khamenei's refusal to accept vaccines as a deliberate act of cruelty, prioritizing ideology over human lives. 2021 presidential election, the rise of Ibrahim Raisi, Khamenei's loyal enforcer. In 2021, Khamenei ensured that a hardliner ally, Ibrahim Raisi, won the presidency. Raisi, a former chief of the judiciary, was known for his role in the 1988 mass executions of political prisoners. Khamenei's Guardian Council disqualified all serious reformist candidates, ensuring Raisi's victory in a sham election with the lowest turnout in Iran's history. The election further disillusioned the Iranian public, with many believing that the Islamic Republic had abandoned even the pretense of democracy. Raisi's presidency marked a new phase in Khamenei's rule, as he sought to eliminate any political opposition, increase economic and military ties with China and Russia to counter U.S. sanctions, expand Iran's nuclear program aggressively, challenging Western pressure. However, Raisi's economic policies failed, and discontent continued to build. 2022, the Mahsa Amini protests, a direct challenge to Khamenei's rule. The death of Mahsa Amini and the outrage that followed. On September 16, 2022, Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman, was arrested by Iran's morality police in Tehran for allegedly wearing her hijab improperly. While in police custody, she was severely beaten and she fell into a coma. 3 days later, she died from her injuries. Iranian authorities denied wrongdoing, but her family and leaked medical reports confirmed she had been killed by police brutality. Her death sparked immediate protests, starting in her hometown of Saqqez and spreading rapidly across the country. The Woman Life Freedom Movement. For the first time in Khamenei's rule, protests were led primarily by women openly defying the mandatory hijab laws, widespread across Iran, including conservative religious cities like Qom and Mashhad, calling for the end of the Islamic Republic, not just reforms. Slogans like "Woman, Life, Freedom," "Death to Khamenei," "We don't want an Islamic Republic," were shouted across the country. Protesters burned hijabs, cut their hair, and defaced pictures of Khamenei, acts unthinkable in previous protests. Khamenei's brutal crackdown on the protests. Faced with a nationwide uprising, Khamenei ordered an all-out crackdown. Security forces shot protesters in the streets, killing over 500 people within months. Tens of thousands were arrested, including students, journalists, and activists. Torture, rape, and executions were used to intimidate the population. The internet was cut off, blocking Iranians from sharing protest footage with the world. Despite the repression, protests continued for months, showing that fear of Khamenei's security forces was weakening. 2023-2024, the aftermath and Khamenei's increasing isolation. After months of violent suppression, Khamenei managed to contain the protests, but at a severe cost. He lost credibility even among conservative Iranians. The economy continued to deteriorate, with record inflation and unemployment. Young Iranians increasingly rejected Islamic rule, seeing Khamenei as a dictator. By 2024, Iran was experiencing more strikes and demonstrations, particularly by workers, teachers, and students. International condemnation, as the EU and US imposed new sanctions targeting Iranian officials. A growing underground resistance, with more attacks against security forces and government buildings. Khamenei's strategy for survival: repression, alliances, and propaganda. At 85 years old, Khamenei faces an unprecedented crisis. However, he is determined to hold on to power through 1. Total dependence on the IRGC. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, is now the real power behind Khamenei's rule. It controls Iran's military, economy, and foreign policy. It silences opposition through arrests, executions, and propaganda. Without the IRGC, Khamenei would not survive politically. 2. Strengthening alliances with China and Russia. Russia supplies weapons and military support, including drones for the Ukraine war. China provides economic investments, helping Iran bypass Western sanctions. 3. Escalating anti-Western rhetoric. Khamenei blames the US, Israel, and foreign enemies for Iran's problems. He continues funding militant groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and Houthis. He tries to rally support by portraying Iran as a victim of Western conspiracies. Khamenei's rule is weaker than ever. Despite his authoritarian grip, Khamenei's hold on Iran is not as secure as it once was. The Mahsa Amini protests and continued economic failures have irreversibly damaged his legitimacy. Signs of weakening power. Even conservative Iranians are turning against him. The younger generation overwhelmingly rejects the Islamic Republic. Protests keep returning, proving that repression alone cannot stop dissent. While he remains in power for now, his long-term survival is uncertain. The next few years could determine whether Iran experiences another revolution or if Khamenei manages to suppress opposition indefinitely. What comes next? With Khamenei aging, the question of succession looms large. The IRGC may play a decisive role in selecting Iran's next leader, ensuring that whoever follows Khamenei continues his authoritarian policies. However, if Iran's protests continue growing, a major political upheaval may become inevitable. Part 8. Khamenei's foreign policy, military strategy, and influence in the Middle East. Throughout Ali Khamenei's leadership, Iran's foreign policy has been shaped by his deep suspicion of the West, hostility toward Israel, and commitment to expanding Iranian influence in the Middle East. He has pursued a dual strategy: maintaining Iran's status as a regional power by supporting proxy militias and allies, resisting US and Israeli influence through military expansion, economic partnerships with China and Russia, and aggressive rhetoric. By the 2020s, Khamenei had cemented Iran's role as a key geopolitical force, but also deepened Iran's international isolation. His policies have led to military confrontations, economic sanctions, and diplomatic crises, but they have also expanded Iran's influence in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, and beyond. Khamenei's core foreign policy principles. Since becoming supreme leader in 1989, Khamenei has adhered to a strict anti-Western doctrine, shaped by Iran's revolutionary ideology and the 1979 Islamic Revolution. His foreign policy rests on several key pillars: anti-Americanism, and anti-Zionism. The U.S. and Israel are framed as Iran's primary enemies. Support for resistance groups. Iran funds and arms Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, and other militant groups to counter Western influence. Expansion of Iranian regional influence. Iran intervenes in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen to build a Shia crescent and counter Sunni rivals like Saudi Arabia. Opposition to U.S. military presence in the Middle East. Khamenei views U.S. bases in the region as a threat to Iran's sovereignty. Strategic alliances with China and Russia. These countries provide economic and military support, helping Iran bypass Western sanctions. These policies have placed Iran at the center of regional conflicts, turning it into a major power broker, but also an isolated state under constant Western scrutiny. Khamenei's expansion of Iran's military influence. One of Khamenei's most effective strategies has been his reliance on proxy forces and unconventional warfare, rather than direct military confrontations. This has allowed Iran to project power across the Middle East while avoiding full-scale war with the U.S. or Israel. 1. The IRGC and Quds Force, Khamenei's secret army, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, particularly its Quds Force, is the backbone of Iran's military expansion. Khamenei has empowered the IRGC to operate militarily, supporting proxies and militias in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Economically, controlling Iran's oil, construction, and banking sectors. Politically, influencing Iran's government, ensuring loyalty to Khamenei. Under Qasem Soleimani, the Quds Force became one of the most powerful paramilitary organizations in the Middle East, orchestrating Iran's proxy wars and strategic alliances. However, Soleimani's assassination by a U.S. drone strike in 2020 was a major blow to Khamenei's military strategy. Though Iran retaliated by launching missiles at U.S. bases in Iraq, the loss of Soleimani weakened Iran's ability to coordinate its regional allies. 2. Hezbollah, Iran's arm in Lebanon. Hezbollah, a Shia militant group based in Lebanon, is Iran's most powerful proxy and Khamenei's key weapon against Israel. Since the 1980s, Iran has provided Hezbollah with billions of dollars in funding, equipped it with advanced missile technology, helped Hezbollah build an extensive military infrastructure in Lebanon. Under Khamenei, Hezbollah has fought multiple wars with Israel, notably in 2006, intervened in Syria to support Bashar al-Assad's regime, expanded its military capabilities to pose a direct threat to Israel. In recent years, Hezbollah has continued its military buildup, with Iranian drones and missiles playing a central role in its arsenal. 3. Syria, Khamenei's lifeline to the Assad regime. During the Syrian civil war, 2011-present, Khamenei doubled down on his support for Bashar al-Assad, ensuring that Iranian troops and militias fought alongside Assad's forces. The IRGC and Hezbollah helped crush Syrian rebel groups. Iran provided billions in military and economic aid to Damascus. This intervention secured Iran's long-term influence in Syria, giving it military bases near Israel's border, a supply route for arms transfers to Hezbollah, a strategic alliance with Russia, which also backed Assad. However, Iran's continued involvement in Syria has drained its economy, fueling domestic resentment toward Khamenei's foreign policies. 4. Iraq, Iran's political and military stronghold. Following the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq, Khamenei saw an opportunity to expand Iran's influence in its western neighbor. Iran's strategy involved backing Shia militias, such as the Badr organization, Kataib Hezbollah, and Asaib Ahl al-Haq, funding and infiltrating Iraqi political parties to ensure a pro-Iranian government. Targeting U.S. troops in Iraq through Iranian-backed militias. By 2020, Iraq had become a battleground between Iranian-backed groups and U.S. forces, leading to frequent clashes and airstrikes. However, growing Iraqi nationalist movements have challenged Iran's dominance, with many Iraqis opposing Iranian interference in their country. 5. Yemen, Iran's proxy war against Saudi Arabia. Since 2015, Iran has supported the Houthis, Ansar Allah, in Yemen's civil war, using them as a tool against Saudi Arabia. Iran has supplied the Houthis with weapons, drones, and missile technology, helped the Houthis target Saudi oil infrastructure, used the Yemen conflict to drain Saudi military resources. By 2021, Houthi missile and drone attacks on Saudi and UAE targets had escalated, further destabilizing the region. However, Khamenei's involvement in Yemen has also backfired, as it has deepened Iran's diplomatic isolation, worsened relations with Sunni Arab states, triggered U.S. and Western military responses. Khamenei's tensions with Israel and the U.S., Iran's nuclear program, and U.S. tensions. Khamenei has consistently supported Iran's nuclear ambitions, claiming they are for peaceful purposes. However, Israel and the U.S. believe Iran seeks nuclear weapons, leading to repeated sabotage attacks and assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists. The collapse of the 2015 nuclear deal led to renewed tensions, with Iran resuming uranium enrichment beyond permitted levels. Iran and Israel's shadow war. Israel has repeatedly bombed Iranian positions in Syria, targeting weapons shipments to Hezbollah. Iran has retaliated with cyber attacks and drone strikes, but has avoided direct war. Khamenei continues to call for Israel's destruction, further escalating hostilities. Khamenei's foreign policy legacy. Khamenei's foreign policy has made Iran a dominant force in the Middle East, but at a massive cost. Severe economic sanctions have crippled Iran's economy. Constant regional conflicts have drained resources and fueled domestic unrest. Rising anti-Iranian sentiment in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon threatens Tehran's long-term influence. While Khamenei's strategy of using proxies and allies has helped Iran expand its reach, it has also created new vulnerabilities. As domestic opposition to his rule grows, his ability to maintain his foreign empire may come under increasing strain. Part 9. Khamenei's personal life, ideology, and the future of Iran after his rule. As Ali Khamenei's rule nears its end, Iran stands at a critical crossroads. His personal beliefs, ideology, and consolidation of power have shaped Iran for more than 3 decades. But widespread opposition, economic hardship, and internal divisions have made his grip on power increasingly fragile. This final section will explore Khamenei's personal life, wealth, and inner circle, his ideological beliefs and influence over Iranian society, the question of succession and what might happen after his death. 1. Khamenei's personal life, the man behind the supreme leader. A private and isolated figure, unlike his predecessor Ayatollah Khomeini, who was highly charismatic, Khamenei is more reclusive and less personally influential. He rarely leaves Iran, never travels abroad, and keeps his private life secret. Khamenei lives in a highly guarded compound in Tehran, known as Beit Rabari, the leadership house. The compound is fortified with tunnels, extensive security, and private hospitals, ensuring that Khamenei remains insulated from the outside world. Despite his public image as an austere religious leader, reports indicate that Khamenei enjoys fine carpets, expensive watches, and luxury items, which contrast sharply with the poverty many Iranians experience under his rule. His family and inner circle. Khamenei has 6 children, 4 sons and 2 daughters, all of whom have avoided the public spotlight. His most influential son, Mujtaba Khamenei, has gained significant political and economic power and is widely believed to be maneuvering to succeed his father. Khamenei's inner circle includes top IRGC commanders who ensure his survival, loyal clerics in the Guardian Council and Assembly of Experts who protect his rule, business elites tied to Satad, the $95 billion empire under his control, which funds his operations. Despite presenting himself as a simple religious man, Khamenei is one of the wealthiest leaders in the world, controlling vast assets while millions of Iranians struggle with poverty and economic decline. 2. Khamenei's ideology and influence over society. An anti-Western, ultra-conservative doctrine, Khamenei's worldview is shaped by deep hostility toward the United States, Israel, and the West. A belief in clerical rule, velayat-e faqih, where religious leaders should govern society, strong opposition to secularism, women's rights, and political pluralism. Throughout his rule, Khamenei has enforced strict Islamic laws, including mandatory hijab for women, cracked down on social freedoms, banning Western music, restricting the internet, and imprisoning activists, promoted a resistance economy, discouraging reliance on the West and pushing for self-sufficiency. Despite these efforts, younger Iranians have largely rejected his ideology. A majority of Iranians, especially women and youth, oppose theocratic rule, compulsory hijab laws, Iran's aggressive foreign policy. Khamenei's vision of Iran clashes with the aspirations of its people, creating deep divisions within society. The cult of personality. Like many authoritarian leaders, Khamenei has developed a cult of personality, with mass propaganda glorifying his leadership, laws criminalizing any criticism of him, heavy control over state media to present him as the defender of Islam. Despite these efforts, Khamenei is deeply unpopular, especially among the younger generation, many of whom openly chant "Death to Khamenei" in protests. 3. The future of Iran. After Khamenei, succession and uncertainty. Who will replace Khamenei? At 85 years old, Khamenei's health is in decline, and the question of who will succeed him is critical. Unlike in 1989, when Khomeini clearly designated Khamenei as his successor, there is no obvious replacement today. There are three main possibilities. 1. Mojtaba Khomeini, the Prince of the Islamic Republic. Khamenei's son, Mojtaba, is a powerful behind-the-scenes figure. He controls the IRGC's finances and many state institutions. Hardliners favor him, but many clerics reject the idea of dynastic rule. Public opposition to hereditary succession makes his rise controversial. 2. A weak figurehead, controlled by the IRGC. The IRGC may install a puppet leader to maintain military dominance. This could be a senior cleric loyal to Khamenei, but without real power. This scenario would turn Iran into a military dictatorship under IRGC control. 3. A leadership council instead of a single leader. Some have proposed replacing the supreme leader with a council of clerics. This would weaken theocratic rule, but hardliners oppose it. Will there be a power struggle? The transition of power could lead to major conflict between hardliners, IRGC, and Khamenei loyalists, who want a tightly controlled succession. Reformists and opposition groups who see Khamenei's death as an opportunity for change. Ordinary Iranians who may rise up in protest against continued dictatorship. If the transition is unstable, Iran could face more internal repression to maintain order, an increase in protests and possible revolutionary movements, further economic decline if instability deters investment and trade. 4. Will Khamenei's death lead to major change? While some hope that Khamenei's death could lead to a more open Iran, his regime has built a deeply entrenched authoritarian system. The key factors that will determine Iran's future include: Factor 1. The power of the IRGC. The IRGC has become more powerful than ever, controlling Iran's economy, security, and foreign policy. If the IRGC backs Khamenei's successor, repression will continue. Factor 2. Public opposition and protests. The Mahsa Amini protests of 2022 showed that Iranians are willing to resist. If protests intensify after Khamenei's death, the regime could face serious instability. Factor 3. Iran's economic crisis, sanctions, corruption, and mismanagement have weakened the Iranian economy. Continued economic decline could further erode regime support. Factor 4. Foreign relations and global shifts. Iran's alliance with Russia and China may strengthen, helping the regime survive. A nuclear deal with the US could ease economic pressure, but it's unlikely under hardliner rule. Conclusion: Khamenei's legacy and the fate of Iran. Khamenei has ruled Iran for more than 3 decades, leaving behind a mixed and controversial legacy. Expanded Iran's military and geopolitical influence, strengthened the IRGC's control over the country, presided over economic decline and widespread corruption, lost the support of Iran's younger generation, faced repeated uprisings that challenge his legitimacy. The two futures for Iran: a continued dictatorship. If Khamenei's successor is a hardliner, Iran will likely continue on its current path. Repression, economic hardship, and international isolation. More protests and unrest, but with brutal crackdowns. A path to change. If Iran's opposition and reformists gain influence, the country could see loosening of religious restrictions, more political freedom and gradual reforms, a potential return to negotiations with the West. However, Khamenei has built a system designed to resist change. His death may not bring immediate transformation, but it could be the beginning of the end for Iran's hardline theocracy.